Thanks so much for the legislative break, sorry. I always apologize to folks when our targets come out at unconventional times. And so we reached this deal on Friday night. We worked hard in our negotiations with Leader Damath and Ways and Means Co-Chair Torkelson to figure out a release time that wouldn't make our media staff work on the weekend, but we knew that once we had targets, they would leak. So we got those out on Saturday morning. So apologies to all the members of our media team and to all of you that on a day you probably weren't supposed to be covering the legislature was the day that our targets were reached. So on to the budget targets. Since we released them over the weekend, we thought we should have an availability this morning to give you a chance to ask the questions that you couldn't ask on Saturday morning. These budget targets represent a compromise between Democrats and Republicans. And if Democrats were setting targets on our own, these targets would, of course, looked very different because we would have asked the wealthy and large corporations to pay their fair share in order to make additional needed investments in public education and affordable health care. Certainly, we've seen in the past when Republicans set budget targets on their own, they typically will prioritize tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations and cutting state government services. But this was a compromise budget, set of budget targets, and so it doesn't reflect either of those base ideologies. In the budget process, this is really chapter one. So we now have the governor's plan for his budget. We have the Senate's plan for their budget. And we have the Minnesota House's plan for our budget. So all the co-chairs in the House will take these budget targets. They will produce bills that match the targets, send those bills to Ways and Means. And when we get back from break, Ways and Means will take a look at those. And then they'll send them to the floor for debate. That's really chapter two, which could be a very interesting chapter in the whole process because, you know, some very disparate chairs and interesting personalities who will have to work together. But then really chapter three and towards the end starts after break. When you see a full budget from the Senate, you see a full budget from the House, we can compare that to the governor's budget. And then you'll see the leaders really working in earnest in the second half of April to hopefully come up with global budget targets in time for the conferees to have real budget targets when they start meeting. Now going forward in the House and in the global budget negotiations, it's really important that we leave our ideological battles to the side and we focus on completing a state budget for the people of Minnesota. That is the job of this session. If we can do that, we can complete our work on time, and that's what Minnesotans expect of us. We're going to continue meeting with the Senate and the governor's team on global targets. We'll be digging in over the next couple of weeks while all the members are working on getting these bills put together and the leaders don't have a gigantic role in that. You'll still see leadership meetings in the governor's cabinet room to talk about budget issues. And we're looking forward to working with both Governor Walz, the Senate DFL, and continued negotiations with the House Republicans to get a budget that Minnesotans can be proud of and to get it done on time. And with that, I think I turn it over to Zach.
Good morning. Well, this was the first real test of the power sharing agreement and our ability to get things done in this system of divided government. And I think it's clear that we passed that test by delivering a responsible House budget on time. And we did it for exactly the reasons that the Speaker Emerita mentioned, that we set aside the ideological battles over policy and efforts to revisit past debates and really focused on getting a budget done, getting the work of this budget done and delivering a budget. And I'm hopeful that that's the way that we can proceed going forward. If we're able to do that, we should be able to deliver a budget that works for all Minnesotans and do it on time.
Good morning, Representative Jamie Long, House Floor Leader. Wanted to just add that I think when you're looking at the budget, one of the important things is not just what's in it, but what's not in it. And I think on the policy side, you see that we don't have targeting paid family medical leave, targeting earned sick and safe time, targeting reproductive rights, universal school meals. All these important wins that we had in the last biennium are left intact because this is a numbers only deal and doesn't have any of those policy extraneous provisions that are in here. So we were able to protect all of those and focus on just getting a budget done for Minnesota. I think the other thing I'll mention is that this does reflect the House priorities that we brought into the negotiations, including additional investments in housing and education and pensions and public safety and protecting our investments in our transportation. So I think even though this isn't the budget that we would have written, you can see where our priorities were and what we were able to stand up for. And I think going forward, we're going to make sure that we're continuing to fight for those priorities, continue to make sure that we're keeping off the attacks on our important wins like paid family medical leave that we know Minnesotans are relying on to go into effect next year. With that, we'll take questions.
Sorry to clarify, did you reach an agreement or assurances to not target those programs at all for tinkering or repeal through the rest of the session and budget, or it's just in terms of crafting this deal, you put them aside for numbers?
Well, what's important right now is that we put together budget bills, and I think Republicans are to be complimented for coming to the table and focusing on the job at hand. And so the only things that are agreed to are the numbers in this deal. There are some, minor side agreements in certain budget areas, but there are no policy agreements. And what I think this shows from both Democrats and Republicans is that we can put together a compromise. Even though we have very different views on lots of issues, that we'll be able to work together on a budget.
I have a two-part question here, but I'll winnow it down to one question at a time here, unless you answer the first one, or the second one, the first question. You mentioned tax cuts for the wealthy were a big priority for you guys, that you weren't able to get that done. What else were you guys looking for in your, sorry, not tax cuts,
Tax fairness.
Yes.
What
else were you guys looking for?
We were looking for increased investment in education. Certainly is one of the things we were looking for that we did not achieve. I don't know if Co-Chair Stevenson wants to say more.
Yeah, I think when you look at the budget deal, we do have some new investments in education. We would have probably gone further. We're proud of what we were able to do in the housing area, but we know there's tremendous need there. There are record numbers of evictions going on right now. I think for a lot of folks, the cuts in the health and human services area are troubling, and we could have avoided some of those if we had new revenue. But in divided government, that wasn't an option. I think it's also important to be looking forward as we see that the chaos in Washington, D.C. and what the Trump and Musk administration is doing, could create real challenges for our budget down the road. But now we have a good cushion in our budget to weather whatever storm comes.
The second part of that was going to be how similar was what you guys were proposing at the table to what we saw from the Senate? And the governor.
Very different, very different. The governor's priorities and our priorities are different. The Senate DFL's priorities and the House DFL's priorities are very different. Thinking back to when Governor Walz and I did this our first time in 2019, there was that very difficult first phase of the negotiations where the governor and I had to get on the same page. We were certainly not aligned in level investment of different areas. So there's certainly 1,000 ways you could balance this budget more. And even amongst Democrats, there's a number of different approaches you could take.
What were the major differences between what we've seen from the governor and the Senate and what you guys were proposing?
Well, what you see in this compromise budget between House Democrats and House Republicans is you do not see cuts in E12 in either the first biennium or the second biennium, with $40 million new money in the first biennium, which, by the way, is earmarked for the READ Act. And zero cuts in the tails. There's a substantially different position than the governor's budget, which cuts upwards of $300 million in the first biennium, and I forget the number in the tails, I think upwards of $500 million. And the Senate target, which cuts $687 million in the tails, is not a place we could ever land.
So on the READ Act, so that money is all for the READ Act, because schools are also asking for other, money for the unemployment insurance backfill this summer and things like that. You're not planning in this budget to do that?
That would be an overreading of the targets. So what the targets do is they give the chairs the freedom to come up with a budget that matches that target. We know of the amount that the E12 chairs agree to spend. They have to agree to spend at least $40 million on the READ Act. Now, they can reallocate funding within the existing budget. I certainly would recommend that they fund unemployment insurance. We were not able to get an earmark in the positive target, but that does not prevent them from doing it. I think from a Republican perspective of complaining about so-called unfunded mandates, and from a Democratic perspective of wanting to make sure that the school hourly workers continue to access unemployment insurance, there's probably a shared priority there that of the existing revenue, they can find the money to specifically fund UI for school districts. But if they don't, that policy is not going anywhere. They'll just have to fund it out of other resources in the districts.
Are you supportive of letting them levy for it?
That is an issue that I think that the chairs will have to figure out, but one of the things that I don't think have discussed yet, unless co-chair Stevenson disagrees, is levy targets. And sometimes we do give the education chairs levy targets.
I don't disagree. That's, Speaker Mayor's exactly right about levy targets. But the thing that I wanted to add is one of the great victories of the 23 session was that we indexed the K-12 formula to education, which means that even at a zero target, education sees significant new dollars in that budget. Over $1 billion of new spending in education is available. And the chairs will have to figure out how to specifically slice and dice those numbers the way they want, aside from the $40 million that needs to be spent on the READ Act. But that was one of the big wins of 2023 and one of the most important things that we can do for our schools. It gives them stability, guaranteed funding on a year-to-year basis that they can plan for, and make sure that we don't fall behind in education as we did for the decades leading up to 2023.
Okay, so
And
there's still the inflationary increase in school funding that's not reflected in, the 40 million comes on top of it, even though there's a negative inflation adjustment in the targets too.
Right, and so the important thing to look at when you're looking at the targets is those are changes to the February forecast base. They're not a change to the base in 24-25, which was elevated by one-time spending, and they're not a change to the base in 22-23, which might be considered more normal levels of spending. But even when you compare, and we did, these numbers to the base in 22-23 and 24-25, you still have one-time spending things that pop out in 22-23. So if you look at, change in base over time, it's hard to calculate like on a percent per year growth in state government. How much does it match inflation? How much does it not match? It's important that Representative Stevenson pointed out that there is forecast growth in education spending and that we're responsible for that from the 23-24 session. That's really important for the school districts. There's also forecast growth in health and human services. And when you see the negative 300 million and the negative 1 billion in HHS, that is from forecasted growth. So that is not a cut to existing appropriations. That is just reducing the growth from what it would have been to a more manageable number. We have, I think the numbers from the state budget forecast was that revenues are growing at about like 3.8% and expenditures are growing at 6.8%. So we have to constrain the growth of those areas in state government where the forecasted growth is higher than the forecasted growth for revenue.
Are you setting up a scenario where you're going to be clashing with the governor and the Senate as opposed to clashing with House Republicans as you've already gotten an agreement? And how difficult is that part going to be, and how far apart are you? Have you had any talks with them?
Well, as I talked about in both the leader meeting on Friday, but also on Minnesota Public Radio on Friday, I'm a bit of a double agent, admittedly, in these negotiations, right? I'm a Democrat. Tim Walz is my ally, Aaron Murphy is my ally, and so I naturally see the world the way they do. But I'm on Team House, and these are the House budget targets. These are the budget targets that our chairs will be working off of. And so when we get to the negotiations and we're at the table and we're sharing our perspectives, I mean, certainly I'll be more sympathetic to the Senate and the governor point of view than Leader Demuth will be, but Leader Demuth and I will be allied in protecting the work that House members are able to come up with. And I think that's really important, especially over the next 2 weeks, as our team has to finally really work as a team. You all have talked about the legislative session in multiple acts. Act 1, acrimony. Act 2, acrimony. This is the part where it has to work. And in order for it to work, Leader Demuth and I have to be a team and not adversaries.
Has this ever happened before?
Well, 1979, yeah.
Okay, but, and how difficult is that going to be? I mean, you've got big differences between the governor and the Senate and yourself. I mean, isn't that kind of awkward?
It'll be interesting. I think Michelle had a question, and then Ryan had a question.
For the DHS target, you mentioned that includes inflationary reductions. Does that include the governor's proposal to do inflationary reductions for disability waivers?
How the chairs will come up with those numbers is really up to them. There are a couple line items that are agreed in HHS, a couple of contracts that will be respecting it within the agreement, but other than respecting those contracts, the governor, or I'm sorry, the chairs will come up with how to get to the -1 billion.
Do you think the Senate and the governor need to come closer to you all, since you're the evenly split chamber here?
No, I don't think that's necessarily true. So, you know, when you look at the work that we do, the voters are the boss. And the voters have sent a Democratic governor. They have given him the power of the governorship. They have sent a Democratic Senate. They have given the Democrats control over the Minnesota Senate, and they have sent a split House. And so the House should not try to assert, you know, undue influence over the other two parties to this negotiation, because they've earned it at the ballot box. And so just as when you have divided government of one of the bodies is either is Republican or the governor is a different party, when it works is when people respect the political power of the other. You know, certainly in 1718, the Republican legislature had a very hard time negotiating with Mark Dayton because they didn't respect his power until, you know, he vetoed their funding and asserted his power, which he had. And I think in 2019, our breakthrough, our first round in divided government and my first round negotiating a budget was when we respected the political power of each of the other entities. Because when you do that, you're not just respecting, you know, Paul Gazelka as Senate Majority Leader, you're respecting the voters that delivered that legislative body to that party. And so you know, in our country right now, with the power of the voters under threat, it's particularly important to assert that that's an important value that we have. And so the governor has a role at the table, the Senate has a role at the table, and the House has a role at the table.
So your numbers actually go farther towards making up the long-term projected deficits. So how important is that in, you know, making this progress over the next 2 years here?
Actually, they don't. Actually, I mean, there is a way to say that the governor's numbers and the Senate numbers are more responsible than ours. And that is because over the next 4 years, both of them include about $1 billion worth of revenue. So the House, Senate, governor had similar appetite for cuts. Nobody likes them. But the Senate and the governor were willing to do the difficult political act of putting revenue on the table. And the House, in this tied situation, were not willing to either cut taxes or increase taxes.
Is the tone in between both parties just compared to last year, are you hoping to avoid what happened last year with the rancor? And do you think that's gonna happen, and do you think this will help prevent that, the fact that you were forced into this kind of agreement?
Well, maybe Leader Long has something to say about that.
Sure,
He
sure.
looks like he's got an idea how to answer that.
Yeah, I think that this is a good start. And I think the fact that this was a numbers-only deal and we left aside all of the policy disagreements is a good start. And I think time will tell if we can get to that point. I know that our team is ready on the Democratic side to make sure that we are getting to a budget that is funding the government and doing so responsibly. And I'm very hopeful that this spirit of collaboration will continue to the end.
I assume the differences in the Senate and House are gonna be hammered out in conference. That's the assumption.
Sure, but the difference is what will the targets be, right? So we have plus 40 in E12 in the first biennium and a 0 in the tails. The Senate, I think, maybe has 0 in the first biennium and a negative 687 in the tails. Before they can get any work done, Governor Walz, Leader Murphy, and the House leaders have to figure out what number are they working off of.
Sorry, I just had a follow-up to that, if that's okay. Within the power sharing agreement, the confines of that, you know, are there assurances for Republicans in the House that they won't be overshadowed by, you know, because the Senate has a Democratic majority, they can send a majority of Democratic members over. Your members could just vote for sort of the Senate numbers in the bill if they agree more with those. Is that?
Well, that's not the way conference committees work. So in a conference committee, it's just not the raw number of votes. So in a conference committee, you have to get a majority of the votes on the House side and a majority on the Senate side for a provision to be included in the conference committee report. So we will be sending equal numbers of Democratic and Republican conferees on the House side. So there will have to be a bipartisan vote in favor of whatever decisions the conference committee makes. So you could, in that way, you could say the power sharing agreement protects the value of Republicans in the House. But also, I mean, I think that Republicans in the House have to have a realistic notion of how much political power they have. If you look at it in six, they have 1/6.
Do you have those, like, Senate DFL had their budgetary balance numbers, like the bottom line numbers? Do you have those?
I do, but so does Zach.
Try it.
Go for it. Do
Them
you need
up there.
cheaters? Because I have cheaters.
No, I actually, this is not, I can do this.
Oh, you have, I have the new one.
Yeah, you have this.
The corrected
I'll
version.
let you do it.
Really, I don't know where to look on the page, so you should do it.
Well, this is the general fund change. It doesn't have the, they're asking about the balance.
Well, then I also have that revised number, if you want to look at this part from, so House Fiscal made some adjustments after we signed the deal, just simple math adjustments.
Yeah, so we will end the first biennium with a balance of $1.6 billion. And we reduce the deficit in the second biennium to a deficit of $1.3 billion. That's, yeah, so we're setting aside the inflation. We're choosing not to spend those inflationary adjustments, the discretionary inflation adjustments. Some things, like the K-12 formula, are indexed to inflation and remain indexed to inflation. That's very important to us. But the discretionary inflation allowance that's in the forecast, we elected not to spend in the first biennium.
Can you talk about why you worded it that way?
Well, the discretionary inflation adjustment is that, it's discretionary, and the other things are in law and would have to change, and we think it's important that the schools get additional funding. But as we are negotiating with Republicans, we reflected the reality that both that we have an upcoming deficit that we want to plan for, and also that needs to be a balance between our priorities and Republican priorities, which were to have more cuts. And so that's where we landed, in sort of a middle ground.
Time for one more. How big of a bonding bill are you all anticipating?
We don't know.
Yeah, I'd say it's still an ongoing conversation.
I mean, are you open to the St. Paul's major requests for funds, like 379 million?
First, to more fully answer the question on bonding bill, so the Senate booked money for debt service in the tails, which we did not. So they booked debt service to go to a $1.3 billion bill in the first biennium and then not have a bill in the second biennium. And the numbers that we adopted would allow for a $700 million GO bill, as was in the forecast, but that doesn't mean that we don't accept the fact that during negotiations with the Senate and the governor that may change. And then somebody had a follow-up question.
Oh, just St. Paul, in terms of like priorities for bonding or other, there's not a lot of other cash, so.
Well, I told the city of St. Paul and the Wild for all the time that they've been bringing up this proposal, that they should look at the Minnesota Twins funding mechanism, and that the days of large state expenditures for professional sports is probably over. The Minnesota Vikings at the US Bank Stadium is probably the last time you're gonna see that for a while, due to fiscal conservatives on the Republican side and social progressives on the Democratic side.
Why did you decide to hold this press conference without Republicans if they're joint targets?
Well, part of it is logistics. The leader is spending important time with her family at this moment. And we reached the deal on Friday night, and so it was kind of like, how do we get the information to you as quickly as possible? And given today was the holiday, that this made the most sense.
Thank you. Thanks all.
Here you go.
Were you wearing twin outfits when you made the deal?
We're not.
We text in the morning to avoid that. We're some of the same students.